we should care about wetland ecosystems. So I already do. So really thinking about why I think you all should also care about wetland ecosystems. And I like to think about the ways that people care about things as being put into kind of two broad frameworks. One of them is really thinking about what does that thing do for you, right? That gives you a reason to really care about that thing. And so for wetland ecosystems, the answer is a lot of things. And so shown here is a non-comprehensive list of many of the ecosystem, the hydrological, some of the economic and cultural services that these systems provide. And so again, if you're someone who thinks that something matters in part because it can do certain things that are really important to you or for you, this list, I think, is one way to think about why these systems are important. Another way that we can kind of approach care and why people tend to care about certain systems, sorry, it's happening, is in terms of cost, right? So how much is it costing me? How much is it saving me in terms of money? And so for wetland ecosystems, we have a pretty decent estimate. So a paper came out way back in the 90s, and then it was updated in roughly 2014, where researchers went out to put a dollar value to the ecosystem services and functions that that global ecosystems provide, but wetlands also included within that category. And so these values have been updated more recently. And what we know is that global wetlands provide functions and services that are valued at $47 trillion a year. And so what this means is that if we were to get rid of every wetland on the planet, every single one of them, it would cost humans $47 trillion every single year to provide ourselves with those same ecosystem services, those same functions that these systems provide just by their existence. And so I think that most people would like to save that kind of money and really value the services that are given. And so I think this is another incentive to care about this kind of space, these kinds of ecosystems. And so wetlands are really, really diverse. So they can encompass a variety of different kinds of ecosystem types. And so shown here are just a handful that I think are really prevalent. And so you have marshes and fens, swamps, peat bogs, and a variety of other kinds of ecosystems. And so given that I say that I work in wetlands, it would be overwhelming to try to work across all of these types of spaces. And so I actually tend to focus on a smaller subset of this, which is really thinking about coastal wetland ecosystems. And so those can be placed into three broad categories, which include salt marshes, which are found in temperate regions across the globe, mangrove forests, which are found in both tropical and subtropical regions across the planet, and then seagrass beds, which are also found in tropical and subtropical regions. And so collectively, these systems make up less than 1% of Earth's total surface area, but they provide numerous functions and services disproportionate to their size. So even though they're only small, they provide a lot of functions for us that, again, are in excess of what you would expect given the amount of space that they take up on the planet. So with that as some of the sort of grounding context here, I think it's important to provide a bit of information about what we have historically known about coastal wetland ecology and how that has changed over time. And so I'm just going to provide a really brief timeline of some of those really important elements of what we have figured out about how these systems tend to work. And so I'll just start here from what is roughly the beginning, where in the 1950s and into the 1990s, really early studies in coastal wetland systems, largely happening in the United States, so on the East Coast and the southeast parts of the US, really tried to evaluate what is causing and maintaining levels of function and energy flow within coastal wetland systems. And these early studies largely concluded that the tides and other abiotic factors are really what controlled wetland system functioning, and that these abiotic, these physical components were really what was most important, and that biotic interactions and biotic impacts are less important in terms of what's maintaining overall function across these spaces. Moving into the 90s and then further into the early 2010s, additional research really took place across these ecosystems, again, largely within the East Coast of the US, but then also parts of Western Europe, within salt marshes in particular, where researchers really identified that consumer species and biological interactions within those spaces actually do play a pretty important role, particularly thinking about how herbivores can have strong effects on vegetation structure and productivity and functioning across these spaces. And so we're now starting to see that it's not only the physical factors that matter, but really some of these biological elements are also important in these spaces. From there and into the present, we've really now tried to identify what are the different contributions of either these bottom-up sort of physical abiotic factors and processes, and those that are happening from the top down. So these biological, these biotic interactions, what's the sort of relative contribution of each of these to the kinds of functions that we're seeing play out across a variety of different ecosystem contexts within wetland spaces. And so a lot of this work is still ongoing. There's a lot of increasing efforts to really try to understand these different dynamics. And something that I think is really becoming a bigger question, and I think is something that will continue into the future, is really trying to understand the role of species interactions and trophic cascades across these environments. A lot of these earlier studies tended to focus on just one particular type of species or one trophic level, and sort of coming to conclusions about how that species plays a role, but really not thinking about that species in its larger context. So in the food webs and the communities and the interactions that they're experiencing, how might those also be trickling across these spaces to have large scale implications for how they function overall. And so as just a quick indicator of what this has looked like in terms of publishing, so this is a figure from a paper that came out a few years ago, but the trends are still quite consistent, where they're looking at the number of papers that have been published across these wetland systems that focus on either bottom-up factors that are controlling those spaces, and so that's the black bar, either studies that come out that are focusing on top-down factors in these spaces, and so that's the white bar, and studies that are a combination of the two, and that's the gray bar. And as is pretty obvious from this figure, is that the large majority of papers out here are really focusing on these bottom-up, these physical and abiotic features across these spaces. And it's true that we are seeing an increase in the number of studies that are really thinking about top-down factors and the combination of the two, but they are far outnumbered by those that focus on these bottom-up. And so we have a much broader understanding and a deeper understanding of the bottom-up features across these spaces, but we know quite less in comparison. Thinking about these top-down factors. And so that's something that has really motivated my interest in these spaces and trying to recognize that we know across other ecosystems that top-down factors matter quite a lot. So there's no reason to think that that wouldn't also be true in these types of ecosystems across various contexts. All right. And so that kind of leads us directly into my actual work. So I know I spent 8 minutes of setup, but I think it's really important to really get into what it is that I do and why I do it. And so one question that I'm particularly interested in is, how do predators influence salt marsh ecosystems? And not just on their own, but really thinking about the interactions that they have with their prey and how those interactions might have attendant impacts across these spaces. And so to get at this particular question, one approach that I have taken is to do field experiments. And so I'm going to walk through one experiment that I did in Connecticut, which is found on the east coast of the US. And so for this work, like I said, focused in New England. So Connecticut is part of the New England region, and I focused on salt marshes, which are a large, salt marshes are a really big proportion of the landscape in New England, especially particularly along the coast. And so within that system, I was working with a really specific study system. So there's a lot of species you'll find within those spaces, but I decided to focus on those that we think are the ones that are playing the biggest roles within these environments. And so that includes, shown here, the purple marsh crab, which is up top, which is a herbivore and a burrowing crab. So it's consuming vegetation both above ground and below ground within these ecosystems. We then have fiddler crabs, so this photo here on the right. And so this is also another burrowing crab, but a detritivore. So it's really consuming organic matter found within the soils within these environments. What I'm showing you here is the predator of the system is the European green crab. And I can answer questions about that later, but this is really an important feature of this particular system. And so the European green crab here was selected as the predator of choice for this work. And then just the smooth cordgrass, which is the dominant vegetation found across these ecosystems. And so this is the study system that I was really focused on. And so to really get at this question of the role that predators and their interactions with their prey might play within these spaces, I did a manipulation experiment. And the way that went is I constructed a lot of these cages across 3 different field sites found in coastal Connecticut. And then these cages were then assigned a variety of different experimental treatments, which are shown here. And so for a subset of them, these were just the open plots or cage controls. And so the idea here is really to understand, how does the site function without me doing anything to it? So what are just the baseline conditions at the site? And then also the cage controls help me figure out whether or not they were caging effects. So did the cage itself change how things sort of unfolded? And so that was another control that was used in this study. The next treatment here is what we're calling the predator exclusion treatment. So in these plots, we had the cages that were established, and the fiddler crab and the purple marsh crab could move freely through these cages, but the European green crab, which can't burrow, is fully excluded from these cages. So these are cages that don't have any predator presence within them. And then we have the third treatment here, which is the predator inclusion cage. And so in this case, just like it sounds, the purple marsh crab, fiddler crab can still move in and out as they feel the need. And then the European green crab is now included in these cages. And so this is the attempt to really add in a trophic level to then see what's happening in terms of how it's impacting broader ecosystem properties. And so in terms of what was measured, in this work, I tried to measure properties that are the most commonly taken measurements across these spaces so that you can really compare outcomes across a variety of other studies. And so some of those are listed here, which include burrow density. And I'll just note that that's chosen as a metric because if you're trying to understand prey population size, because they burrow, you can't just easily go out and count the crabs themselves. You can't really know exactly how many are there. And so burrow density, so the number of burrows that you can count within a certain space, is a useful proxy for population size. And so that's pretty typically used within these spaces. And then in addition to that, I measured above ground biomass, soil organic matter content. I measured extractable available nitrogen in the soil, and then also the rate of change in soil nitrogen. And this is really meant to be an attempt at understanding how soil nitrogen is being mineralized. And each of these are really thought of as some important ecosystem properties that can tell you quite a bit about sort of the health and function of these environments. Okay, so on the next slide, what I'm going to do is show you the results in what will seem like an overwhelmingly large figure. And so I'm actually just going to show you snippets of it at a time and just walk through elements. I will say that it won't be helpful to focus on the details, but really think about broader trends. And so I'm going to try to highlight those as I go through that slide. And so just to set up the stage here, so across the bottom, I'm just noting the different treatments across each field site. So the control, the no predator treatment, and the predator treatment. Across the top, we're just noting each of those 3 field sites that I worked at. And then along the y-axis, I'll eventually start to uncover different variables so that you can see what happened with each one. And so starting here at the top with looking at soil organic matter content in the soil, what I'm going to do is just highlight for you the sites where I saw significant differences relative to the treatment. And so I won't go into the details of what those differences were, but just want to note whether or not we saw changes due to the experimental treatments that were applied. And so for soil organic matter content, at 2 of the 3 sites, we did see some significant differences due to experimental treatment. And so that's all I'll say about this for right now, and I'll move on to the next one, which is thinking about the amount of nitrogen content in the soil. So at all 3 sites, I saw some significant differences between treatments when looking at nitrogen. And then the last one I'm going to show here, I think, is biomass. Yeah. And so for this one, at 2 of the 3 sites, we saw some significant differences due to experimental treatment when looking at biomass. And so just as kind of a big picture here, you can see that there's not a lot of consistency, right? So we saw some changes at some sites. The ones that we did see changes that weren't necessarily the same kind of changes we saw at other sites. So there's clearly a lot of context dependency here that's really driving what some of these outcomes might be. And we have some estimates or sort of guesses about why we think certain things turned out the way they did. But I think the bigger picture here that's important to take away is that we are noting significant changes, right? So predators, their interaction are causing some kind of change in different measured variables. And that tells us more than we knew before. So historically, we really just had an understanding of those physical components, or we knew about herbivores and how they impacted spaces. But now when we add in this other trophic level, we can start to see that there are certain important changes happening here. And that's notable and worth looking into further. And so I always do this. I forget the slide is here. So this is like the takeaway slide of everything I just said. So again, predators and species interactions are having effects. And so we did notice those things happening. And then again, that they're context dependent. So you can't necessarily fully predict a change based on just the experiment, because there's lots of other things at play here that might be influencing some of these outcomes. Okay, I'm also going to take a quick drink because I'm like flying through it. I'm going to slow down. All right, and so the next question here that I have then is really thinking about the application of these findings. So something that I'm really interested in my work is not only understanding systems better, not only really producing additional scholarly information, but really finding ways to apply it in the real world. So what are the ways that we can take this information and use it in the way that we manage ecosystems? And so the next question then is really trying to understand, do predators have a role to play in particular salt marsh restoration within the context of these Connecticut field experiments? And so before I can really get into that, I do want to, again, provide additional context for this angle. And so wetlands are incredibly important, as I noted earlier, but they have been lost at huge rates across the globe. So they're among the most endangered ecosystem types that you'll find globally. Between 35 and 60% of the world's wetlands have been lost since the 18th century. And there are a variety of different reasons for this, but what I'm highlighting here are 3 of the reasons that are largely due to humans. And so the first one here is thinking about land conversion. So taking something that used to be a wetland and turning it into something else, either like agriculture or urban development. The next one is climate change. And so climate change and its associated sea level rise has been implicated in significant losses of wetland spaces, especially coastal ecosystems that can't really keep up with the levels of that sea levels are increasing. And then the last one here, which is really a bit more of the focus of my work, is sort of the removal of important species across these spaces has been shown to have these cascading effects that lead to the loss of that system overall. And I know that that sounds really dramatic, but it is something that has been noted across a variety of different spaces where these cascades can lead to the loss of the system, where you end up seeing something that looks quite a bit like this. Where, for example, if you remove a predator from the system, you have a surplus of herbivores that are really able to overconsume and overgraze vegetation. It can lead to a site that looks quite like this, which has been overconsumed, is unstable because now that root structure is not really present, so you lose a lot of the soil platform. And so this is very clearly an unhealthy, underperforming wetland ecosystem. And so one of the goals then of restoration is to try to take a space that looks like this, do a bit of work, and then turn it into something that looks more like this. And so this is theoretically a visually healthy, functioning wetland space. And so there are a lot of different restoration efforts that have been ongoing across the globe, but the outcomes are not exactly what people tend to hope for. So the success rates are actually quite low when it comes to thinking about restoration efforts. And so I just want to highlight what that looks like in practice. And so this is a figure from a paper that came out several years ago now, where the authors were trying to compare how restored wetlands functioned at a variety of different ecosystem services that they were measuring compared to, in this case, the degraded state. So we're looking at a figure here that compares performance of a restored site versus an unhealthy degraded site to see whether or not we're seeing improvement. And so the 0 line here would indicate that they perform the same. Positive values indicate that the restored site performs better than the degraded site. Negative values here indicate that the restored site underperforms compared to the degraded site. And as is pretty obvious to see here, restored sites perform better than the degraded site, right? You're getting a recovery of different ecosystem services, of different ecosystem functions, and that's great. That's accomplishing at least part of the goal that you're hoping for in putting in that work in the first place. But there is a second way to try to evaluate success. And so that's really thinking about, what if you compare the restored site to a healthy site, so to a site that hasn't been significantly damaged historically. And so when you do that, the story is quite different. And so again, shown here, we're seeing a comparison between a restored site, but now comparing it to a natural site. And for almost all of the different functions and services that they're measuring here, with the exception of some of these cultural services, restored sites underperform compared to these natural healthy sites. And the average here is by about 33%. So biodiversity and ecosystem processes are reduced in restored wetlands by 33% when compared to these natural spaces. And so that means there's this really important gap that we haven't figured out, right? So trying to understand what are the things that we're not doing well, that we're not getting recovery from in our approaches to restoration when we compare them to these natural sites. And one thing that I think is really important to think about, and why we might not be getting the kind of recovery we're looking for, is really just thinking about what approach are we taking to restoration in the first place. And so there's a wide variety of approaches and things that happen depending on the context, depending on the location, depending on the reason why the site was degraded in the first place. So there's quite a bit of variation in approaches to restoration. But there are a handful of steps that tend to be seen across all of them. And so the first one is really just thinking about removing the disturbance, right? So whatever is happening in the site that's causing a negative impact, you want to make sure that that is addressed before you move forward. And so that's typically the first step in any restoration effort. The next one is to really focus on the soil. So try to make sure that the soil has been rehabilitated, that you have proper soil organic quality, and that you have improved the hydrology. So hydrology is a really important aspect of coastal systems and of wetlands in general. And so making sure that that is established is also usually quite key in many efforts that are taking place. And then the last step is typically to just think about restoring the vegetation. And so the vegetation here in this context is really thought of as a physical feature. So it's habitat. So the goal here is that if you establish vegetation, other things will come back into those spaces. And then the functions that they perform will also recover over time, as long as we set the stage for them to come back. And these are kind of the traditional approaches to thinking about restoration outcomes. And so I want to really quickly show you what this has looked like, a quick example of what this can look like. And hopefully this works. And so what I'm going to show you here is a really quick time-lapse video of a restoration effort that happened in Massachusetts. And so as a tiny bit of background for this, so this marsh is being restored, or it's a bog. And so this bog is being restored. It was converted sometime in the 1800s into a cranberry bog so that it would then produce cranberries. It had economic incentives. And so that's what it was used for roughly 100 years until the market for cranberries went down. It wasn't really making any money. And so the owners of this land decided to convert it back to the bog that it was before. So a sort of natural functioning bog system instead of one that's being farmed for a particular commodity. And so I'm just going to show you this video. It's about a minute long. There's no sound to it, but really just showing you what some of the steps look like and how it gets done. And so this is the bog. And as you can see, what they're basically trying to do here is reestablish hydrological connections across the space. And so there had been some dams in this region previously. Those dams were then taken down. And across most of the space, what you're seeing is they're just kind of removing sediment and removing soil. So here, you'll see it a little bit over here at a certain point, and trying to just get natural hydrological flow happening across these spaces again, with the assumption that you'll have recruitment of vegetation, seeds, pollinators, all of these things will happen over time. And so I'll stop talking just so that you can watch the rest of this video play out. So as you can see in this video, so they don't do any planting here. So this is all just natural regeneration after the sort of connecting of hydrological flow systems were accomplished. And in a lot of ways, that's one of the most important things that you can do. And so that's really the reason that this was really taken as their first effort. And so I could have paused it so that you could have seen the before and after, but really the takeaway here is that they sort of considered that a success, right? And sort of converting it back to what it had been before, but taking a really simplified approach. So really just focusing on those physical aspects of the system. But so again, as you can imagine, one thing that I'm curious about is what role might top-down factors play in this process? So can you imagine a situation where incorporating these biological interactions might be an important component in how we think about restoring these spaces? And so I think that there is a really easy way to think about this. And so I'll just go back to the picture before. So again, this is a site that has been completely overgrazed. The assumption here is that that happened because there was a lack of predator presence in these spaces. So these herbivores could really grow to large numbers, consume all the vegetation, and then sort of move through the system, creating spaces that look like this. And so when you're in an environment that looks like this, I like to make little schematics. And so let's pretend it looks like this. Where you got the soil, it's been denuded and fully consumed the vegetation, probably largely due to the herbivores in that space. And so we're saying in this case would be purple marsh crabs. You can imagine that in a situation like this, in addition to making sure that you have the proper physical components in place, it might also be really important to think about reintroducing certain species within those environments that might help recover additional functions within the environment. And so in these cases, you can see that if you have a robust predator population that is reintroduced within these spaces, they are then able to have top-down control to moderate the population size of their prey. vegetation is able to grow back within these spaces. In some cases, there are lots of cases where the overconsumption makes it really difficult for things to grow back, where planting becomes a really important aspect. But maintaining and understanding the role of the species within that space is really important. So then you can have, again, a happy functioning system, which again might look something like this. And so in my work, I'm really trying to understand what are the ways, or what's the potential really for predators to be included in a lot of these processes, or at least what are the potentials for different consumer species that are important to be incorporated within these processes. And so for this work, I basically just did the same experiment, but I did it over a longer period of time and then asked a different question with it. One thing that's really important for restoration work is to know that you're usually not going to see gains just in that first year. So average recovery time for successful projects is really about 5 years, where you're really getting the decent recovery of the different services and functions that you're looking for. So for this experiment, I did the exact same thing, ran it over a longer period of time just to see what could happen. And so we can sort of envision in this case that this treatment is a situation where you're in an environment where the predator has been removed. And this treatment is in an environment where you are now reintroducing the predator into that space. And so really trying to think about that comparison. And so we do have some evidence that this could be an important thing to consider depending on the contexts. And so shown here, we're just looking at one particular variable included in this study. And I'm just going to walk you through what's shown here. So again, the treatments across the bottom. The variable itself here doesn't necessarily matter, but the trends are really what's important. And so this here is the control treatment. So this is the level of function that we have within that system on its own without any manipulation. And we can make an assumption here that predators are present across these spaces. So this is not an environment that has had any significant negative impacts at the predator population level. And so then for the predator exclusion treatment, we see a significant decline in sort of that particular function that we're looking at. And so that's notable. So the absence of the predator really brings down the level of function of this particular variable. And then when we have the predator included treatment, we see that that level of function is really coming back, right? So the recovery of the predator within this space is really allowing this particular feature to come back up to levels that are very similar to what we saw within the baseline conditions. And so this is evidence that this might be an important consideration when thinking about how we perform restoration in these environments. And so one other piece of evidence is shown here. And so again, this was run across multiple years. I don't have all of the data shown here, but I just a really quick snippet is looking at the biomass. And so we've got conditions where there's no manipulation happening. So this is, again, baseline conditions. We remove the predator, we see the significant change. We replace the predator in a sense, and we see that it's coming back down to what you might expect compared to the control treatment. And so there's questions about why this exact trend happens, but that's something that we can also talk about a little bit later. But again, it's showing us evidence for the role that predators might play across these kinds of systems and thinking that they might be useful to include in restoration efforts. And I want to be clear here in saying that while I'm talking about predators in particular right now, it could be any kind of other species that plays an important functional role. And so just thinking about the role that that particular species might play, including it in an environment where that particular function is important, could be a really good way to help jumpstart recovery or get additional recovery across these spaces. And so as you can imagine, there are a lot of sort of caveats and other things that you have to consider in order to really even think about doing this kind of work. That includes thinking about differences within the ecological community. So who's even in that environment? What roles do those species play? You can also have differences in how species respond to predators. So different anti-predatory behavior can have different responses and lead to different impacts on the environment. So in my case, when we're thinking about these burrowing species, you can either have cases where they're going to increase their burrowing efforts to avoid predators, or they're just going to leave and go somewhere where they know that there aren't predators. And so those different behaviors will have different impacts on the environment that they're found in. The other important consideration here is local and regional context. And so understanding the land use history of the space that you're working in, and also what's happening around that environment. So are there external inputs into that system that might be influencing the outcomes that you're observing? And that's really important. No site is separate from its surrounding environment. And so it is important to be aware of what's happening in those broader spaces. And then again, temporal scale. You're not going to see recovery in the first year normally. And so you have to think about doing this kind of work that is representative of the timescales in which these outcomes can actually be observed. And so that's really important. And so the last consideration that I also think is important, and it's another element of the work that I do, is really trying to recognize the contributions of these bottom-up factors and also these top-down factors. So thinking about the physical and abiotic ones, but then also those top-down biological interactions and impacts. And so in this particular study that I also was just highlighting, one thing that I did was looking across the 3 field sites that I was working in, tried to identify whether or not bottom-up or top-down contributions were more important. So which ones were really playing a dominant role within this space. Usually the controversy, at least the historical controversy here, is it's either one or the other, but in reality, it's usually a combination of the two. And so I was really trying to figure out what that looks like across the spaces that I was working in. And so I won't go through all of this in detail because it can be a little bit confusing. But for each of the field sites, I effectively did a path analysis. And so what that does is it allows you to put all of your variables in one model and try to see which ones are influencing the other ones relative to the rest, and sort of telling you which ones are really driving outcomes. And so I'll just highlight, and so I made these more intuitive figures as sort of my path diagrams to kind of highlight what that looked like across these 3 different spaces. And so just looking at this one particular field site, for this one in particular, what the path analysis said or turned out is really that burrow density, so the amount of herbivores within that space was a driving feature here for one of the variables, so for nitrogen content across the space. And that was the one that was most important, even when you include all the other variables. And so that's considered kind of a top-down feature that's dominant in this particular site. For another site, we saw something slightly different, where we saw that organic matter content was really important in determining nitrogen content, and that burrow density was really important in determining biomass. And so we got a combination of the two, right? So burrow density is thinking of a top-down feature. Organic matter content is really thinking of this in terms of an abiotic or a physical feature across the space. So now we're seeing that both of these are playing important roles within this particular site. And then for the third site, again, a combination. So we're seeing that the predator played a role for nitrogen content in the soil, that burrow density down here was important for organic matter. It was also important for nitrogen. And we're also seeing here that nitrogen absorption, so thinking about mineralization of nitrogen, was important for biomass production within these sites. So we're seeing a combination of the two, but largely the top-down features are driving outcomes at this particular site. And so what this tells us is that these things are really important and they're really nuanced, and you have to really think about these things holistically and collectively to really understand the full function of these environments. And so although the experiments I have been doing, or at least the ones that I did at those sites, focused on the top down, I am curious about the rest, right? So really understanding the whole system together, which adds complexity, but it also is more realistic. And I think that that's a direction that we should be trying to move in with some of the research that we do. And so for me, this kind of lends itself well to thinking about next steps in this overall process. Because I'm curious about the context dependent. So we're seeing these changes happening due to predator presence or absence, but it's different depending on where you're looking. I'm really trying to figure out what are the different contexts, what are the different variables within those contexts that are shifting and shaping the outcomes that we're seeing. And so one way that I'm really interested in doing this is really just doing the exact same experiment, just like everywhere, right? So just trying to do the exact same thing, try to do it at the exact same time with as many similarities as possible, and then identify the differences within the environment that might be shifting the outcomes that we're seeing across these studies. And so one example here is that the work I did previously was in New England. I now live on the West Coast in Canada, so I'm hoping to do the same kind of work in marshes that are found across these spaces. Again, keeping as much the same as possible, and then measuring other things happening in the environment that might be leading to differences. I'm also really interested in shifting into different systems. And so I had been working a lot in salt marshes. I now want to move into mangrove spaces. And so I've got some sites that I'm setting up in mangrove areas, and really interested in thinking about how these same kinds of dynamics might play out across a very different coastal ecosystem type that is really important, that is at risk, that has been an important focus for restoration efforts. And so trying to think about the ways that these kinds of questions might fold really well into what's already being done within those environments. But the last thing that I do want to say that is not a science component, but something that I think is really important is trying to recognize that lots of other things matter across how these spaces function, across how people use these spaces, beyond just doing experimental treatments in these environments. And so I'm also really invested in thinking about the roles of local communities and their influences on these systems, but also their uses of the system, how they value the system, and how all those things need to be considered when we think about land management. It's really not just about science. It's about really thinking about these systems collectively, which includes humans. And so one of the things that I'm doing more now is incorporating culture into this kind of work. So meeting with people, trying to recognize what are the cultural values that they have associated with these systems, and trying to make sure that those are integrated in the way that management is taking place. And so there's a lot of evidence that this is important. So there's increasing studies that show you that cultural ecosystem services, indigenous communities, local communities, all have one really vested interests in these environments, and also have the tools, the history, the knowledge for how these spaces are managed. And it's important to make sure that those voices are incorporated into the work that you're doing. And not only from an extractive perspective, right? So not going in and saying, what are the things you know, how can we use it? But really thinking about, what are the things that you value? What are the ways that we can help build capacity to support that and make sure that it's fully included in this work? What are the ways that people can be given leadership positions, given power to really dictate what's happening and be autonomous as much as possible? And so that's something that I do a bit more now, is really thinking about the role that the social components also play in managing these systems. And so I think that that's kind of consistent with my overall vision, in the fact that I do think it's important to see these systems in as complete of a way as possible. So not only thinking about their separate parts, but also thinking about how they all sort of move and work together to perform and to result in the kind of things that we see today. And so for me, it really is thinking about a marriage between these natural systems, how they function, ecological knowledge in ways that are typically thought of as being quite Western, but also incorporating communities. So engaging with local communities, providing capacity, providing resources, and making sure that they're able to leverage their own knowledge to help contribute to outcomes that are also really important to them. So those are things that I think are important. Always want to make sure I include it in every talk, even if it is in a traditional science department, because I think it's important and it's something I'm always happy to talk about. And so I'll end it with that. Some super quick acknowledgements. Here's a ton of people I've worked with. Here's some of the granting and funding agencies I've been able to get money from. But besides that, again, I just want to thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being here, and looking forward to chatting and trying to answer as many questions as I can.
Wow, that was awesome.
Thank you. It was a whirlwind.
it's a whirlwind, but it's also, it's like bam, 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 and right on the, like, stick the landing.